A United States Senator walked into my courtroom with 2 attorneys, a prepared settlement offer, and the quiet certainty that this would be over before lunch. I asked him one question, 4 seconds long. It stopped him cold. He stood at that podium, a man who had helped write the laws that the rest of us are required to follow, and he could not answer it. Not because the question was complicated, because no one had ever thought to ask it before. Because in 31 years of public service, he had simply never been required to stand where everyone else stands and account for what he had done. What happened over the next 6 weeks, in that courtroom, at a folding table in a community center, and in a quiet phone call he made himself, from his own phone, with no one coaching him, is a story I have thought about many times since. If you believe that justice should mean the same thing, regardless of the title on someone's business card, I hope you'll subscribe before we go further. I have been on this bench for a long time. I have many more of these to share. Now let me tell you about the senator, and about Dorothy, and about a question that neither of them will ever stop thinking about. Do you know who I am? I have heard that question in this courtroom more times than I can count. It usually comes rehearsed from someone who spent the drive over practicing it, a man who believes his zip code entitles him to a different outcome, someone who has confused a relative's connection to a city official with actual immunity from accountability. When I hear it, I look up from the file, keep my face completely neutral, and say, yes, I know exactly who you are. You are a defendant on a docket. And then we proceed. But Senator Donald Hargrove never asked that question, not out loud, not directly. And that is the important distinction. He didn't arrive believing he deserved special treatment. He arrived believing the concept of special treatment didn't apply to him. Because in his understanding of how the world works, the people who write the rules and the people who live under them occupy different floors of the same building. And he had always had an office near the top. That is a more dangerous kind of certainty, and it is much harder to reach. My clerk Margaret walked in without knocking on the morning of the hearing. She never forgets to knock. Her face told me everything before she said a word. The specific expression of someone carrying information they would prefer to set down and walk away from. She was holding a red case file against her chest with both arms. In her other hand, the office telephone receiver, the cord pulled taut across the doorframe. She covered the mouthpiece. It's his communications director, she said. Senator Hargrove's office. They've been calling since 8. She paused. He says the senator's appearance this morning is a courtesy. He says if the case is dismissed before the session opens, the office will ensure our facility's grant application receives favorable review. Another pause. If it proceeds, the application will be reconsidered. I took off my reading glasses. Hang up, Margaret. If Senator Hargrove has business in this court, he can state it from the defendant's position, not through a communications director at 8 in the morning. She hung up. I opened the red file. Carroll Avenue and 5th Street, 6 days earlier. 9:47 in the evening. Red light. 11 seconds elapsed with pedestrians in a valid walk signal. A Thursday evening literacy class letting out from the Carroll Avenue Community Center. The senator's vehicle estimated at 34 miles per hour in a posted 20-mile-per-hour zone. 1 pedestrian injured. Dorothy Park, 68 years old. She had stepped off the curb on a walk signal and fallen when the vehicle came through the intersection. Fractured right wrist. Officer Patricia Chen's field notes were unedited and precise. When she pulled Senator Hargrove over, he had presented his Senate identification card and informed her directly, without apparent concern, that she would want to think carefully before writing anything down. Officer Chen wrote everything down. By 9 that morning, 2 of his aides had already arrived at the courthouse attempting to negotiate a service corridor entrance and priority docket placement. My response through Margaret: front door, standard screening, public gallery. His name called when it is called. He arrived at 9:22. Charcoal suit, flag pin on the lapel. A phone he did not put away when he sat down. He took a seat in the gallery without acknowledging a single person around him. Not the young man beside him reviewing a parking citation. Not the woman across the aisle with a toddler on her lap. Not the bailiff who held the door. He sat with the posture of a man who has spent so long being the most important person in every room he enters that the habit has become structural. Something his body does automatically, like breathing. He was fourth on the docket. I took the bench, greeted the room, and noted that this court exists to serve all of the people of this city. Every one of them, regardless of what brings them here, and regardless of how long they've been waiting. First case, Walter Gray. Walter was 74 years old, a retired postal worker. He had not been cited for anything. He had filed a voluntary witness statement. He was the primary pedestrian at Carroll Avenue and 5th Street 6 days earlier. He had come this morning because he wanted to be present. He walked in slowly, carrying a canvas tote bag with a library logo on the side, and took a seat in the front row. He placed the bag on the seat beside him with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that careful deliberateness costs nothing and prevents a great deal. I entered his statement into the record and thanked him for coming. 15 feet behind him, Senator Hargrove checked his phone. Second case, a 29-year-old woman who had received a citation for an expired parking meter. She stood at the podium with the self-conscious stillness of someone who has never been in a courtroom before and is uncertain about the correct way to hold her hands. I asked why the meter had expired. She explained she had been inside the hospital emergency room with her mother. The situation had taken longer than expected. She had not been able to return to the car. I dismissed the fine and waived the administrative fee. I noted for the record, at a volume the gallery could hear, because I intended the gallery to hear it, that this court exists to serve the people of this city, and that the purpose of this room is not to compound the difficulty of an already difficult day. She said thank you twice and sat back down. In the 22 minutes since the session had opened, this courtroom had heard from a retired postal worker who came voluntarily to bear witness to something he had seen, and a young woman who was late returning to her car because her mother was in an emergency room. Both had arrived on time. Both had waited their turn. Both had asked for nothing beyond what was fair. Senator Donald Hargrove, who had run a red light at 34 miles per hour through a crosswalk full of people because he was running late to a hotel, was next. I called his name. He stood, buttoned his jacket with the automatic precision of a man who has stood before rooms full of people 10,000 times, and walked to the podium. Two attorneys appeared from opposite sides of the gallery simultaneously, positioning themselves on either side of him with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Hargrove did not wait to be addressed. He identified himself, referenced his committee assignments, and informed the court that he had reviewed the citations thoroughly and was prepared to resolve the matter responsibly. He nodded to the attorney on his left, who produced a printed document, a draft settlement agreement, already prepared, and named a figure designated for the city's Pedestrian Safety Infrastructure Fund. The gallery reacted, not loudly, but audibly. I looked at the figure. I set the document down. I looked at Senator Hargrove directly. Senator, I said, before we discuss what you are prepared to offer, I have one question. He met my eyes with the patient confidence of a man who has answered many questions in many rooms and has not yet encountered one he could not manage. Do you know the name of the woman who fell? The attorney on his right began to speak. I raised one finger. He stopped. I waited. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was simply accurate. Hargrove's mouth opened slightly. He looked briefly at the settlement document on my bench, as though the answer might be somewhere in the preparation his team had done overnight. It was not. I opened the red file. Dorothy Park, 68 years old. Thursday evening literacy class at the Carroll Avenue Community Center. Fractured right wrist, right-handed. I looked up. She has not been able to write in 6 days. I read every word of it into the record at the same measured pace I use for everything in this room. Then I closed the file. I have a second question, I said, and I want you to hear it completely before you answer it. or before your counsel answers it for you. I kept my voice level, not lower, not harder, the same. You sit on the Senate Judiciary Committee. You have sat on it for 11 years. In that time, you have helped write, revise, and vote on the laws that Officer Patricia Chen is required to enforce when she is 2 blocks from Carroll Avenue at 9:47 on a Thursday evening. I paused. My question is this: if Dorothy Park had been driving that car, and you had been the one crossing Carroll Avenue on a valid walk signal, and you had been the one who fell on that curb and fractured your wrist, would Dorothy Park be standing at this podium this morning to make a donation? Or would she be standing here to answer for what she did? The gallery did not make a sound. It was the silence of a room in which everyone present is doing the same calculation at the same time and arriving at the same answer without needing to say it aloud. Hargrove's lead attorney placed a hand gently on his client's arm, the way you steady someone who has lost their footing. Hargrove did not move. He did not look at his attorney. He did not look at the settlement document. He looked at me. And for the first time since he had walked through those doors, the structural certainty was gone. What was underneath it was simpler. A man standing in a room where the usual arrangements did not apply, and knowing it. I picked up my pen. The settlement offer is declined. This court does not resolve traffic citations through infrastructure donations. I want that noted clearly in the record, not as a commentary on generosity, but as a statement about what this proceeding is. This is not a negotiation. It is a hearing. I set out the sentence. The maximum applicable fine for each of the 3 citations issued by Officer Chen. A mandatory pedestrian safety course administered by the city's traffic division to be completed within 30 days. And in lieu of any financial contribution, 20 hours of voluntary reading service at the Carroll Avenue Community Center Adult Literacy Program. The Thursday evening class, the same one that was letting out when Dorothy Park stepped into that crosswalk. Beginning this week, I was also ordering a certified copy of the full citation, including Officer Chen's unedited field notes in their entirety, entered into the permanent public court record and transmitted to the Senate Ethics Committee, not as a complaint, as a matter of institutional transparency. The law applies to the people who write it, with equal force as to the people who live under it, I said. The record will reflect that this court understands that principle, even when others have forgotten it. The lead attorney was on his feet before I finished the final sentence. I looked at him over my glasses. Counselor, your client came to this courtroom this morning to make a problem disappear. I am not in the disappearing business. Are we finished? He sat down. Senator Hargrove appeared at the Carroll Avenue Community Center the following Thursday at 6:45 in the evening. Plain gray suit, no flag pin, no aide, no portfolio. He introduced himself to the program coordinator as Richard, not Senator, not Mr. Hargrove, just Richard. She showed him to a folding table near the window and told him his student for the evening was already seated. Walter Gray looked up from the table without any particular expression and said, "Good evening." They began. Walter did not acknowledge the intersection on the first Thursday. He did not acknowledge it on the second. He had come to be taught, and he worked with the unhurried focus of someone who has decided that this matters and has allocated the appropriate amount of himself to it. At the end of the second session, he picked up his canvas tote and said, "See you next week." By the third Thursday, Hargrove had stopped checking his phone before class. By the fourth, he had learned about the grandson. Walter was working toward a specific goal, a children's illustrated history of the Postal Service, because his grandson wanted to be a mail carrier when he grew up, and Walter wanted to be able to read it with him and understand why the boy cared so much about it. On the fifth Thursday, Hargrove arrived 10 minutes early. He placed a copy of that book on the table before Walter sat down. Walter picked it up. He looked at the cover for a long moment. Then he set it down, opened it to the first page, and said, "Read me that." Somewhere between the fourth Thursday and the fifth, Senator Hargrove called Dorothy Park, not through a staffer, not with prepared remarks or a communication strategy. He called her himself from his own phone in the evening, and when she answered, he told her who he was. He said he was calling because he owed her a conversation, not a transaction, and he wanted to know how her wrist was healing. She did not hang up. They spoke for 40 minutes. He paid her medical expenses in full, every dollar of it, quietly, without announcement. He established a small fund through the city's Victim Assistance Office for pedestrians injured in moving vehicle incidents. He asked Dorothy's permission to name it after the intersection where she had fallen, Carroll and 5th. She said yes. He co-sponsored a pedestrian safety bill with a senator from the opposite party, mandatory safety certification for all sitting federal legislators every 2 years, and a formal end to the informal professional courtesy that had historically made traffic citations against elected officials a quiet rarity. Officer Patricia Chen was formally commended through his office as a matter of public record. He did all of this before he came back to court. He did not tell anyone he was doing it. He simply did it. 6 weeks after the sentencing, Margaret knocked on my door and told me he was here. I walked into the courtroom. He was standing at the podium, alone, plain suit, no pin, no portfolio, no one on either side of him. He had the quiet, settled energy of a man who has stopped managing the surface of himself long enough to find out what is underneath, and has decided that what he found there is worth presenting without assistance. He reported everything. 20 hours completed. Dorothy Park contacted directly. Carroll and 5th established. The bill co-sponsored and in committee. Officer Chen commended by his office as a matter of public record. I looked at him across the bench, not with warmth exactly, but with the specific regard I reserve for people who have done the harder thing when the easier thing was sitting right in front of them. The question I asked you the first morning, I said. It was not rhetorical. I know, he said. I've been thinking about it every Thursday. Good, I said. Keep thinking. I picked up the gavel. Case dismissed. He left through the front door. In the corridor, Walter Gray was waiting. Canvas tote. Same posture. The patient stillness of someone who knows the value of showing up. Hargrove stopped. They shook hands. Walter said, "See you Thursday." Hargrove said, "I'll bring the second book." Then he walked out into the street and hailed his own cab. No aide, no motorcade, just a man going somewhere, the same as everyone else on the pavement around him. I have thought about that morning many times since. Not about the fine, not about the sentence or the bill, or even the commendation for Officer Chen, though all of those things matter and all of them were right. I think about the silence after that question. The moment when a man who had spent 31 years in public service, who had helped shape the laws that govern this country, stood at a podium in a municipal courtroom and could not answer a 4-second question about the name of the woman who fell. Not because he is a bad person. I do not think he is. I think he is a person who had spent so long on a floor of the building where the rules get written that he had simply stopped thinking about the floors below, stopped thinking about who lives there, stopped thinking about what a crosswalk looks like at 9:47 on a Thursday night when a literacy class lets out and a 68-year-old woman steps off the curb on a walk signal she has every right to trust. Dorothy Park's name. That is what he did not know. And that is what changed everything. The law is not a building where some people stand inside and others look in through the window. It is either the same room for everyone, or it is not a room worth having. The moment it begins making exceptions based on the seal on someone's identification card, it stops being a courtroom and becomes something else entirely. A place where outcomes are determined by altitude rather than evidence. Where Dorothy Park's fractured wrist is a line item to be managed rather than a harm to be answered for. Senator Hargrove arrived with a settlement offer and 2 attorneys and the quiet structural certainty of a man who had never once been required to stand where everyone else stands. He left with a question he could not stop thinking about for 6 weeks. Dorothy Park's name. 20 hours at a folding table near a window, a children's book about mail carriers, and a grandfather who wanted to understand why his grandson loved the idea of it so much. These are not significant events in the architecture of a Senate career, but they are precisely the things that separate the person who writes the law from the person who understands what the law is actually for. The next time you are driving and someone is crossing the street, a woman leaving a Thursday evening class, a man carrying a canvas tote with a library logo on the side, remember something. They have a name. You just don't know it yet. If this story stayed with you, if that question stayed with you, share it with someone today who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what you thought of in that moment of silence. I read every one. I've been on this bench a long time. I'll be back with another story soon.